Hello and welcome to Polesbow, a town of about 10,000 inhabitants located in Kitsap County, right next door to Washington's Olympic Peninsula. That's this thing, 3,600 square miles of mountain, rock, forest, and history. Just a 30-minute ferry ride from tossed salad and scrambled eggs. And it's here, friends, that the story of Dwarf Fortress takes place. Polesbow loves to celebrate its Viking heritage. It was founded by a Norwegian immigrant in the 1880s, and then a bunch of Scandinavians from the Midwest decided to join him. And if you squint, you can kinda see why. The landscape around here is reminiscent of Norwegian mountains and fjords. It's a cute little origin story, one that the townsfolk celebrate with local festivals and Norse-themed businesses. But it doesn't paint the entire picture. You see, 800 years before the founding of Polesbow, a guy was in a field in Yorkshire when he got an arrow stuck in his eyeball. Wincing from the pain and unable to defend himself, he was quickly set upon by a group of Normans. They plunged their swords into his body, stopped his heart, and in so doing, ended the age of Vikings. If you're ever in Hastings, you can visit the spot where King Harold of Norway died, in the wonderfully named Battle Abbey. I know this because my hometown was founded by Vikings in 914. Waterford, or Vedjefjord, was the original capital of Ireland. I grew up skateboarding right next to Viking walls, on which Norman invaders would later build towers. Before them, there were Gaelic Celts who believed in supernatural gods. Before them, there were inhabitants who used metal tools. And before them, stone tools, all the way back to the last ice age. No Viking has ever stepped foot in Polesbow, but on the day the last Viking died in a field 5,000 miles away, there were people here. Tribes of fishermen and weavers who had lived off this land and the surrounding waters for thousands of years, back to when the Puget Sound was itself a slowly retreating glacier. The county that Polesbow resides in is named after one of their most important modern leaders. The nearby metropolis was named after another. Strangers from faraway places brought with them disease and a lust for land, forever changing the story of this place, the people who lived here, and the land they lay claim to. Why am I telling you all this? Because the game we're going to chronicle in this 4-part series is about exactly this: people, history, and the power of stories. And much like the stone Vikings standing watch outside the gates of Polesbow, there's a lot more to this story than meets the eye. Whenever people ask me why I think Dwarf Fortress is one of the most important games ever made, there's this one story I like to tell. I choose this story not because it's a particularly good example of the moment-to-moment gameplay of Dwarf Fortress, it's really not. I choose it because it effectively explains the holy trinity at the heart of this game. The story goes like this. A user called Randy Noman on the Dwarf Fortress forum had made a fortress next to an area where mer people lived. Upon finding one of their corpses and realizing that the bones were worth a small fortune, he asked his fellow players to help him create a mechanism that would allow him to trap the mermaids in a cove, drain that cove, and then harvest their mer bones. The story goes that this brazen act was so cruel that it forced the hands of the developers, a pair of brothers who'd been working on this game for years, to get involved.
So Mermaid Bones is very funny because it happened so long ago that the community has essentially invented an alternate persona for me that I don't know if it existed or not, because it's kind of more prudish or something than I think I am. But if someone produced receipts, I'd cop to it immediately, obviously, right? So now the bones of a mermaid live presumably inside a mermaid's body when it's alive. Like, did they shoot Ariel with crossbows? Like, what were they doing? I don't remember.
So butcher them? Or?
Yeah, because you can't just butcher. You need it to be dead before you can get the bones out of it. You can't get live bones out of it. That's the thing. But like, so they had to kill the mermaids somehow. I don't remember how that worked. I don't remember mermaids. It may be just that mermaids drown in the air. I don't know. You can see where a theoretical Tarn is like, oh, come on now. Let's put an end to this. process, but I don't see that. I mean, to me, the problem is the bones were worth too much or something.
Okay.
But
why were mermaid bones worth so much?
because they're a fantastical kind of interesting creature, right? And I like for dragons, like dragon bones are worth 10 times as much or something like that. So probably just went through that like, hey, mermaid. It's not a walrus. It's a mermaid. So walruses might be worth 3 times as much, and mermaids get to 10 or something, right? And so now our very mercenary players are like, well, I know which one I'm harvesting then, right? Not the walrus. I'm not gonna make a walrus farm, I'm gonna make a mermaid farm because it's about that min-max or whatever. But yeah, that's kind of how it turned out though, is that we're like, this was when the players went too far. This, like I said, I bow before receipts. It's fine. I mean, I might have been a different person.
Tarn was definitely a different person. That incident happened 15 years ago, 6 years into the development of Dwarf Fortress. And the reason why I love it is that it contains the triumvirate of elements that make this game so special. First, the game itself, a complex interwoven ant colony style simulator of dwarven society that's been in development for over 2 decades. Secondly, the people who play it, a community of dedicated storytellers responsible for some of the most awe-inspiring and hilarious tales in all of gaming. And thirdly, the game's creators, Zach and Tarn Adams, brothers who have dedicated most of their lives to developing this singular, ever-expanding video game.
We've spent over 3 years filming this one because we wanted to make the most comprehensive version of the history of Dwarf Fortress. And in this first episode, we're going to tackle the prehistory of this fascinating game.
Our mission is to not only tell the story of this remarkable game for its dedicated fans, but to explain to those of you who have never played Dwarf Fortress, and who probably never will play Dwarf Fortress, why it's so special.
Alright friends, grab yourself a pickaxe. It's time to strike the earth.
My name is Zach Adams, and I'm the co-founder of Bay 12 Games, the makers of Dwarf Fortress. My brother is primarily the programmer, and I'm more of a producer, I'd say. It's like I gotta keep Tarn fed and watered and drive him around and that kind of thing. The designing is primarily what I give to Dwarf Fortress, along with Tarn, of course. So I'm 2.5 years older, yes. I mean, we were best friends through all of this. And through the years, it's been the same thing. We actually had a twin speak when we were growing up. We actually made up a language with each other and stuff like that. And that's actually what the kobold language is in Dwarf Fortress, is this nonsense language me and my brother had made up.
So, whoa, okay, so yeah, we've got a little Victor streaming here. And that's actually, relevant to the question because the kobold language came from how my brother and I used to scream at cats. As long as I can remember, we've always been just playing with our toys and doing things, living in the same house, always had the same interests we were interested in very different kinds of computer games mostly, but we had some intersections, so we'd always play Starflight together and play roguelikes together, watch each other playing roguelikes. When there was periods though, like when he was in high school, he had his high school friends and I had this is like near the end of our time in California. Then we moved to New Hampshire and had to find all new friends and stuff. It was kind of sucked, but for both of us.
It was their father's work that forced Zach and Tarn to move around so much as kids, but it was also his work that would set them on the path towards games development.
So our dad was one of the first people that introduced the computers to sewage treatment plants. Before that, there was nothing to keep track of the oxygen level of the digesters. So okay, no, there's too much oxygen in the tank, so that this would go outside the circle. So you're looking at all these stars and circles, and he invented that.
What was his background? Was he an engineer or?
He was an engineer, yeah. He was into radios and stuff like that. He was a radio man in the Vietnam War.
Is that what he did up until he retired, the sewage automation?
Right, he graduated from sewage onto fresh water. So he moved away from the dark side, and so in this town he worked for the clean water system and making sure that people didn't drink sewage.
I still remember sitting in a chair as a little toddler seeing a for loop for the first time. The initial way that Zach and I learned how to program was we had these Byte magazine things that we could type in, or you could go on a BBS and download a full basic file, and there would be one one called Temple of Loth, which was just this little grid that you'd walk around and you had a lamp you could shine on the room. So we learned that then.
The brothers were always close, they shared hobbies and enjoyed spending time with each other, but making games provided them with a near endless runway for creative expression and collaboration. Like any brothers, over the years this collaboration waxed and waned. When the family had lived in California in the early 90s, Tarn had taught himself to design games in BASIC, while Zach was working on some adventure games with his school friends. When their father's job moved them to New Hampshire, the boys had to find new friends all over again. And it was then that Tarn learned C, around 1993, when games were going through a 3D revolution. Tarn told me about how excited he was when he wrote his first Z buffer, something that would prove quite useful in a 2D game a decade or so later. In these teenage years, the boys started collaborating again, with Zach adopting his co-designer-producer role. They worked on dozens of concept projects. Some of these never made it past paper design or basic prototype, but most were created as fun side projects. This continued when the boys and their family moved to Washington's Olympic Peninsula, while Tarn was in high school and Zach was in university, and it's here that the family has called home ever since. Zach transferred to the University of Washington in nearby Seattle, and the boys continued to collaborate. From 1993 to Tarn's first year in college in 97, they worked on a C version of Drag Slay, a basic game that Tarn had made years earlier. Especially the final year when both boys were attending UW together and shared an apartment. But when Zach graduated and began to live his own adult life, Tarn began to feel the pressure of the real world and decided to choose a vocation. And so for the next few years, the boys didn't work on any games together at all, while Tarn focused on mathematics.
That was a bit of a dead zone, and then I moved down to California for grad school, just kind of trying to pursue this kind of life, and immediately was like, just kind of overwhelmed with how grad school was. I coasted through undergrad, just coasted through. I never took notes in classes or anything. It was just the strangest thing. I did very well. And then grad school, suddenly I discovered I had no student skills. Like all of these skills people had been developing their whole lives that I hadn't needed. Suddenly I'm no longer able to absorb the information well enough to just sit in class and absorb it. It's just too complicated now. But it was the first time I'd also kind of been really away from everybody. Like I had no one in the state of California that I knew at that time. Not a person, no family, no friends, no nothing. Over that summer before I moved down there, like we had started working, we kind of like Zach and I kind of reconnected on the games a bit, and we were working on this weird sort of 3D, that's kind of like when Armok started. Like we were like, okay, we've got these 3D skills, we can make this 3D game and try and get this RPG working again and see what we can do with that. And this is in the kind of context of, well, we're still gonna like, you know, just kind of as hobbyists throw our games together, because we were not releasing games here.
We had so many dead projects in our graveyard, hundreds of dead projects, and we released maybe one game. This game knew all of the tissues in your body. It knew how curly the hair on your arm was. You could set any set of stance points, your feet and your hands, and would procedurally generate animations for them. Terrible animations. Here's a cat person standing on their hands, and there's their tail sticking up there.
Right, I have a bachelor's degree in history, and that was also history. That's a long time ago. I worked at the Naval Shipyard for a while, and then I worked at a gas station for a while, and I just ended up working at places like that. I just didn't want to be a teacher, and that's pretty much the only thing you could do.
And we also had no concept, still I don't know why, but we had no concept of even starting our own thing. Like Zach had a job, I was doing math stuff, but this is a hobby that we just love doing all our lives, and just thought of it. I mean, it was more than a hobby. It was like we thought of it just as this thing we do. It's like this is what you do when you're not working, and you do it a lot, but it has no kind of future that intersects an occupation or anything like that. Just because when I was down in grad school and I was kind of going through this kind of miserable adjustment period, it was such a mess down there that I literally don't remember the impetus that caused me to put up the webpage. There was just a webpage. When we put the Slaves to Armok thing up there, people get to those web pages somehow. So we eventually got this little thing where we now have people, like actual people, and like 10 of them, you know, it's like, but they're all interested in seeing, you know, in kind of cheerleading this game, seeing where it goes, and also kind of helping, you know, direct our thoughts on it and stuff a bit. and also like talking about other people's games. I know Tom Proudfoot's games figured heavily into there. Just these really interesting sort of, like if you remember the old SSI RPGs, some of these early sort of tactical RPGs.
Okay, let me cut in here. This needs some context. When role-playing games exploded in the 1980s, it created several branches which have continued to grow and splinter to this very day. That's how you have games like Baldur's Gate 3, which lean heavily on the character and storytelling aspects of Dungeons & Dragons in a beautifully realized 3D world. And then games like Bethesda RPGs, which emerged from the first-person immersive subgenre of titles like Ultima Underworld. While these two RPG branches from the D&D video game tree are popular today, there is another direction RPGs went in that you might be less familiar with. A company in the Bay Area called Strategic Simulations, or SSI, had been making strategy and tactical games since the late 70s. Most of these were based around military combat and sport, but they even had sci-fi and fantasy scenarios. Well, in the late 80s, they started their Gold Box series, a set of RPGs made between 1988 and 1992, which approached the RPG genre from a more tactical angle. These games had you navigate in first person, but combined that perspective with an overhead tactical display for combat. Tarn was inspired by developers like Tom Proudfoot, the next generation of developers who were taking what SSI did in the Gold series, and instead of moving into a more 3D direction, which added immersion, retained the original 2D graphical style, but added more tactical complexity, essentially creating a subgenre of RPG simulators. These RPGs wouldn't focus their efforts on characters or storylines, but create worlds that were able to offer so much complexity that the player would simply play them and the stories would emerge from that act of playing. With Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, Tarn and Zach had tapped into a small hardcore community of people who were passionate about this dying subgenre, but they forgot perhaps the most important lesson for making RPG simulations. For goodness sake, don't do it in 3D.
Just these really interesting sort of, like if you remember the old SSI RPGs that kind of like some of these early sort of tactical RPGs, there's a continuation of that into games that are much more sort of interesting than the originals. And that's kind of what Tom Proudfoot represents. And he was doing like literal credit card sales with like, instead using a paper manual. It is just the thing that's just not quite gonna work. Like we're not quite in the PayPal era, which is, I mean, basically I mean, in some sense, the difference between Tom Proudfoot and I is like 3 years or whatever, and that's all that made the difference. Right. Like, because we had a tip jar that could function when we got to that point in 2006. But anyway, that's quite a bit forward in the chronology of anyway, but we're kind of not, I mean, we're sort of at the end of whatever you asked about. I don't know, and then I just start telling the whole story of Dwarf Fortress again, which I've told before. I believe I've literally told you the whole story before. So yeah, we're just getting a different angle on it, so we can stop and redirect at this point.
Yeah, no worries. It was actually one of the questions I was going to ask was, should we just use the footage from our previous interview to talk about the history of these projects? Yeah,
I mean, it's footage that's there. It seems like people might yell at you rather than me if you're reusing footage.
We can just cover it in B-roll.
Yeah.
No one will know. Your voice hasn't changed, right?
No, not that I know of.
Well, we'd always been working on a kind of fantasy role-playing simulation type game. Even when I was like very, very young, I remember in elementary school we had a game called Drag Slay. So we hadn't really seen a kind of RPG fantasy type game that really indulged in the same things that like Civilization was doing or whatever, where you could make a whole map or whatever. There was the roguelike games, which of course we were heavily into, where they make their own dungeons and so forth. But we just wanted to make the whole world. Why not make the whole world? So I created the Bay 12 website. I started giving away the game we were working on at the time for free, and at that time it was like the fifth iteration of this Drag Slay game. It was called Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, this really terrible 3D game where we had changed our philosophy at that point to like, oh, let's build from the bottom up. So we were like, okay, now we're constructing this 3D model of this person who can like walk on one hand or one foot if you set the stance variables that way. It's got these really terrible animations, like terrible, don't wow too much here. And but it had like tissues and so forth. There were spells that would like strip the skin off of people or teleport people's noses over, and the little models would move and stuff. It was like a fun little playground, not much of a game at all, and it took us years to get that far because we didn't know what we were doing. But that was the game we were working on at the time, and so we had this other kind of side of games that we were doing, because that's just, it's a slog where you're adding features very slowly. And so I'm like, okay, side project 3 days, side project 3 days. And this is where things like World War I Medic, which is one of our games that's gotten like a small amount of press. There's Liberal Crime Squad, which is another game. That's an ASCII game, right? Text graphics or whatever. There are several of them, and that's what Dwarf Fortress was gonna be, right? Dwarf Fortress was like, a few years in, we're like, I wanted to make a game kind of like Dig Dug or something. It was actually, there's this game called VGA Minor, which is, it's got like this cross section. You go down in an elevator and you dig and you get like just your minerals and you bring them back. And this is from like the 90s or something. Okay, let's make a game called Mutant Miner. You go down and dig just like that, except you find like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles mutagen canisters and you grow extra arms so you can mine faster. And now you have progression, right? Or whatever. This is a game now. So we're like, we need to make it real time, right? It's got to be real time in order to deal with these multiple things. So now you've got multiple little people running around digging and so forth. And this is still a side project. And then we had like this, okay, we're gonna make it about dwarves. You dig. Dwarves always screw up and dig too deep, they die. They leave behind their little workshops and things, and we were gonna like generate diaries and things like that. And then you'd bring an adventurer in to go and find out, as many little things as they could about the game you had just played. And so the dwarf mode makes your maximum score, and then the adventurer you send in gets the realized portion of the maximum score. Tight little, almost arcade game, right? We were really excited about this idea, so we scoped it out 2 months. And well, you see now that's gone. It just started like, because it was a fantasy game, that was probably our mistake. It started to siphon the features from the main one, right? Because it's ASCII graphics, so it's so much faster to put stuff in there. And as opposed to like this 3D thing we were working on. And so just every little idea that we had for the other game that we hadn't gotten to in 5 years, just slot it right into Dwarf Fortress.
In 2004, Tarn and Zach decided to stop updating Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, and instead focus on their top-down Dwarf project, which was allowing them to implement interesting game design concepts at a much faster rate, due in no small part to the fact that it didn't require any graphics to be made. Instead of using 3D characters like Armok, or even sprites like other tactical RPGs, this game would use ASCII, a standardized list of characters used in electronic communication to display the game's various characters and entities. A practice that up until that point was fairly common in multi-user dungeon games and roguelikes. And perhaps with a small teaspoon of self-awareness, they decided to call this new game Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, Chapter 2, Dwarf Fortress.
The community was kind of there, ready for the Dwarf Fortress release, and we had announced a couple years before in like 2004 that was our main project. By that time, the kind of sucking away of features from the 3D game had been so complete that we had to say something, because we were just working on this dwarf game now for a couple years or whatever. And we went ahead and launched in August 2006 was our first release, and then that 200 people quickly grew.
Tarn struggled with depression during his time at Stanford, but by now had completed his PhD and was on to a postdoctorate at Texas A&M. But life was about to get harder for Tarn. Even more isolated and struggling with his new teaching job, Tarn spiraled into a deep depression. His only way out as he saw it was to quit his job and come home. It was a shock to his family, especially as he'd committed years to his education and didn't have a plan B. Zach had also been struggling with his own problems too, but working on Dwarf Fortress was a source of fun and focus for both of the brothers.
What happened next would go on to change the lives of Zach, Tarn and their families, but it would take almost 2 decades for most of that change to come.
The first version of Dwarf Fortress was released in August 2006, and it would remain a free game for people to download and share for 16 years. In our next episode, we'll tell the story of that period of time, how the game slowly turned into one of the most complex simulations in games, the community of storytellers who embraced it, and how exactly the brothers survived while developing a fairly niche game that they were giving away for free.
You can watch episode 2 of this series right now over on patreon.com/Noclip if you want to support the work we do here to tell the stories of video games and preserve video game history. In fact, every episode of this series will be out a week early over on our Patreon.
What were your parents like when it came to you guys working on this project? Like, supportive, or did they worry? Did they ever try and pull you guys away from it, or?
They did not try and talk me out of it. They just weren't going to, they knew they were going to be able to talk me out of it. They knew that I was dead set on doing this. And even though there was no indication at all, like I quit my job 2 months or so before Dwarf Fortress came out as a text game for free on the internet. Like there was nothing there. There was no real expectation that we would be able to survive on the money for it. They probably thought I was just going to go become like a math teacher or something like that when it failed. Like not like immediately like there's going to be no roof over his head type worry, right? So they're just like worried, but not really worried. And I was planning to move back up there, so they probably thought I was, just going to move back in and find a job, and things will be okay for him. And then this happened instead. Slowly over a long time, and they worried for 2 decades, but yes.